On July 22, 1943, a training plane piloted by a Polish pilot took off for the first time from Grigorievski airfield near Ryazan. On that day, the first Polish fighter squadron formed in the Soviet Union began training. It was soon to take part in the battles for the liberation of Poland. The extraordinary enthusiasm of the cadets and the tireless work of the Soviet flight instructors made the impossible possible. Only a month after the first training flight, at the end of August 1943, the cadets, having mastered the theory and technique of piloting a training aircraft, moved on to mastering fighters. In September, training of the 2nd and then the 3rd Squadron of the Warsaw Fighter Aviation Regiment began. One airfield was no longer sufficient for the flight program. The Soviet command decided to use the nearest airfield in Żytów for training Polish squadrons, and over Grigorievski day and night roared engines yaks. It continued to improve their skills. Polish cadets. The instructors, the best Soviet military pilots, considered it their sacred duty to train their Polish friends as quickly and better as possible. The excessive workload literally knocked the instructors off their feet. The Soviet pilots who came to the Warsaw Regiment gave a lot of effort to make this Polish unit one of the best. They became patriots of the regiment. At the end of the fall, 2 squadrons mastered the basis of aerial combat, aerobatics figures. Unfortunately, in the winter of 1943-44, bad weather made it very difficult to train the young Poles. Only in the spring at the airfield in Włosów, where there was a concrete runway, fighter pilots passed the last exam on theory and piloting techniques. But finally, the long-awaited hour came. In a solemn atmosphere, the cadets were awarded the officer rank. It was an unforgettable day in their lives. 8 months of classes, difficult because they were conducted in Russian, which the vast majority of cadets did not know well, the first flights with an instructor, the first difficulties in the air, the uncertainty of the novice and the subsequent success when the machine becomes obedient to the will of the pilot, all behind, all only memories, and they are the more dear and closer the farther they go into the past. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Taldykin, regiment flies to Gostomel near Kiev for combat training. Ivan Taldykin. He was not only the commander and mentor of the Polish regiment. This man, with an open Slavic soul, who possessed extraordinary tact, won for himself such love, respect and trust of his subordinates as only an elder friend or father. Taldykin knew everyone, cared for everyone, and valued everyone at face value. An excellent organizer, he found the way to the heart of youth so soon and imperceptibly, as only a man with an innate talent of educator can do. A brave soldier, a man of fairness and intelligence, he managed to create in the regiment exemplary order without abusing disciplinary penalties. Thanks to his great experience, the first combat successes came with minimal losses for the regiment. Charming simplicity and modesty of Taldykin contributed a lot to the fact that in a very difficult situation of the first baptism of fire in the regiment established an atmosphere of friendly participation. In Gostomel Fighter Regiment remained until August 19th, the day of departure of the unit to the front. Dis airfield, near Lublin, was the first airfield of the regiment on the Polish land liberated from the occupants. From there, after a 2-day stay, it flew closer to the front line, to the airfield in Zadybastar near Żeleszów. Here, on the Warsaw direction, the 1st Polish Army was fighting. Its battle path, which began near Smolensk, passed through its native land, between the Western Bug and the Vistula. It was here, together with the 1st Army, that the 1st Polish Fighter Aviation Regiment began its combat operations. On August 23rd, the regiment flew on its first combat mission. It was to cover the actions of the 3rd Air Assault Regiment, which was tasked to strike at Hitler's fortifications in Wałka. Everyone wanted to take part in the first battle. And it is not surprising that everyone envied the lucky ones assigned to the flight. Lieutenant Colonel Taldykin sent to the task only squadron commanders, link commanders and pilots who had trained them to fly in Grigorievski. To this group, Lieutenant Colonel added 2 more old pilots to cover their young comrades from above. "You are too few for me to risk you in the first battle," said Taldekin. He continued to introduce young people into the battle gradually, often personally leading the flights. Continuing and here to teach pilots the complex art of aerial combat, the commander taught them not only to fight the enemy in the air and on the ground, but also to fight their own fear, with frivolous bravado, with all that prevents thoughtful and meaningful combat. From the very first days of September, the regiment, together with the 3rd Air Assault Regiment, defended Warsaw and its heroic insurgents from enemy artillery fire, fought air battles with German planes over the blazing Polish capital. The 2nd Aviation Regiment of night bombers Krakow at this time dropped food and ammunition to the insurgents. The famous Corn planes made 3 and even 5 sorties per night. Skillfully manoeuvring, they made their way at low altitude to the capital, dropped containers and returned for a new load. In Warsaw and its suburbs, Hitlerites had a lot of anti-aircraft artillery. As soon as our airplane approached the city, it was immediately enveloped by a solid ring of bursts. Machines often returned to the airfield with holes in the wings and fuselage, damaged engines and electrical equipment, punctured tanks. But the heroic efforts of the technical staff brought the planes back into service the very next day. Polish mechanics worked tirelessly. They were sleep-deprived, malnourished, worked all night long, and the machines were always ready to fulfill combat missions. In the battles for Warsaw, the regiment lost 2 airplanes. On September 24th, enemy anti-aircraft guns shot down the machine of Major Vikerkevich, who was making his 4th combat sortie. For a long time the pilot was considered dead, but, as it turned out later, he managed to save himself. Major managed to jump out of the burning machine and descend by parachute, but was captured. He escaped from the prisoner of war camp and hid behind enemy lines until the Soviet army arrived. From October 1944 until the beginning of the January offensive in 1945, the command of the First Army focused on aviation reconnaissance. To fulfill this responsible task, Lieutenant Colonel Taldekin allocated permanent pairs which conducted reconnaissance in the areas specified for them. Reconnaissance, organized in this way, allowed each pair to thoroughly study the terrain in their area and notice the smallest changes occurring on the ground. The slightest regrouping of enemy forces, movement of transport and units, movement of motorized columns, accumulation of troops, nothing escaped the attention of aerial scouts. The best pilots of the regiment flew on such missions in constant pairs. Lieutenant Bobrowski, Korunji Broch, Lieutenant Gashin, Korunji Żurawski, Lieutenant Gabis, Korunji Lazar, Captain Matveyev, Korunji Kromi, Lieutenant Kalinowski, Lieutenant Kozak, Lieutenant Stackhouse, Korunji Wesznitsky, Lieutenant Baev, Sub-Lieutenant Gosiuminski, Captain Lisecki, Lieutenant Szpakowski, Lieutenant Verbitsky, Korunji Gorodecki. Reconnaissance was conducted in 3 directions, in the south, west and north. The main charge was given to the settlements, Grodzisk, Pruszków, Błon, Nadarzyn, Mokotów, Piaseczno, Gruecz, Wieliszów, Modlin, Jabłona and Nowy Dwór. The last, perhaps the most difficult task of the regiment in 1944 was the aerial survey of enemy fortifications along the Vistula River, in the zone of the forthcoming offensive of the First Polish Army. This task was accomplished by a single unit consisting of Captain Matveev, Trunzego Kroma, and Lieutenants Kalinowski and Kozak. Photo flights over enemy positions were by no means safe. The fascists, of course, did not sit idly in their hiding places when over them, at an altitude of 800 or 1,000 meters, appeared a link of our planes. All anti-aircraft guns of the enemy at the same moment spewed hundreds of shells into the sky. All anti-aircraft weapons were directed at the 4 machines with Polish white and red identification marks. Fortunately, most of the shells did not hit the target. And this was not at all because the Nazis did not shoot well, but because the planes were maneuvering all the time. The pilots, skillfully hiding behind the clouds, quickly took pictures and again went into the clouds, made short exits to the target and again took pictures. They would suddenly appear over the enemy positions and approach the object from the side of the sun, to make it difficult for the enemy anti-aircraft gunners to aim fire at the planes. The pilots resorted to various tricks to photograph almost inaccessible objects, making 2, 3, and even 10 approaches. Captain Matveev's platoon justified the hopes of the command. The future offensive strip of the Polish divisions was recorded on photographic film with all details. These aerial photographs were later used to make a detailed map on which not only the road network and terrain, but also all the trenches, wire fences, anti-tank ditches and firing points were clearly visible. This map gave a fairly clear picture of the enemy's defence system. The map was reproduced and distributed to the commanders of all units and subdivisions, down to platoon commanders. This undoubtedly contributed to the success of the offensive of the First Polish Army in January 1945. At that time, a major offensive of the Soviet Army began. The ground groaned from the powerful fire of artillery and rumbled deafeningly under the caterpillars of tanks. Clouds of airplanes covered the whole sky. Every day the Third Folk flew out to attack German positions in Warsaw, Modlin, Pruszków and Leszno. It was covered by fighters of the 1st Regiment. The enemy could no longer throw many fighters into the battle, so the 1st Regiment not only fulfilled its tasks of covering, but also took part together with the attack aircraft in the destruction of enemy ground targets. The most formidable danger for the attack aircraft were anti-aircraft batteries of the enemy. Therefore, while the Eilis were dropping bombs and shelling targets with rockets, the fighters kept the anti-aircraft gunners under fire until the Eilis finished their work and left the zone of fire. Only after that the fighters struck at clusters of echelons at stations, columns of infantry and vehicles. Every day Hitlerites were rolling further and further to the west. The area of action of Polish airplanes increased so much that there was hardly enough fuel to reach the airfield. Covering the crossings, patrolling over their communications was the last, but very important and responsible task of the regiment at this time. True, fascist planes now rarely attacked our objects from the air. If they dared to do so, it was only suddenly and always with superior forces. And yet meetings in the air ended, as a rule, their escape. Hitler's pilots did not flee in a chivalrous way, without taking the fight. At the same time, the Polish pilots fought more and more confidently every day, with increasing enthusiasm. After all, the battles were fought on Polish territory. After all, now they, Polish pilots, to a great extent depended on the expulsion of the cruel enemy, so many years trampled their enslaved homeland. That is why they fought stubbornly, fiercely. They fought for all the offences, for the innocently tortured, for the mockery and humiliation, for the dishonoured women, for the death camps, for everything. The heroism of the pilots of the 1st Fighter Aviation Regiment, shown in the battles for the liberation of Warsaw, was noted in the order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Army. In the first days of February, the regiment moved to a new airfield in Saniki. A few days later, the most experienced pilots of the regiment flew to the recently liberated airfield in Bydgoszcz. It was not easy to manage flights at the airfield in Bydgoszcz. In addition to the Polish Air Division, 3 Soviet fighter regiments and an attack division were based here. Hundreds of airplanes several times a day flew on combat missions, and the airfield had only one runway. Despite these difficulties, the airplanes regularly flew on missions, and good work of the maintenance staff and excellent training of pilots prevented accidents. The 1st Fighter Regiment again received the task of covering the attack aircraft. The best pilots of the regiment conducted reconnaissance over Debrecno, Wierzchow, Zloczenek, Chojnice, Pila, Czarne, Jastrów, Szczecink, Chokivel, Czaplink and Drawsko-Pomorsk. Polish names of settlements on the native Polish land were mixed with German names. This land was liberated after a century of captivity by the armies of the United Slavs, walking hand in hand. This time for eternity, and here the combat path of the regiment is marked by Polish and Russian blood spilled together. In the air battle, the commander of the unit, Lieutenant Gosiuminski, died, and during the attack on Pila, one of the best scouts, the commander of the unit, Captain Oleg Matveev, for participation in the battles to take possession of the town of Vezhkovo, which the Nazis fiercely defended, the 3rd Assault and 1st Fighter Regiments, acting together, were noted in the order of the commander of the 1st Army, General Poplavsky. Reconnaissance flights of the 1st Regiment gave a lot of valuable information to the Army Command. Thus, Lieutenant Kalinowski discovered a camouflaged column of German tanks near Cheskoye, and soon these tanks were destroyed by the assault aircraft of the 3rd Regiment. The report of Lieutenant Bayev about a large group of enemy tanks that broke through the encirclement ring from Pila helped to destroy them. And after the breakthrough of the Pomeranian rampart, the regiment received a second commendation from the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Army. In March 1945, the troops of the 1st Belarusian Front approached the Oder. At the same time, the 1st Polish Army, acting as part of the troops of the right wing of this front, was fighting for Kolobrzeg. Polish Aviation Division, including the 1st Fighter Aviation Regiment, moved to Debazen to support the advancing formations of the 1st Army. Dense spring fogs coming from the sea hampered the regiment's combat operations, which were conducted by small forces. For participation in the battles to capture Kolobrzeg, the city, which Hitler's command considered an impregnable stronghold, the regiment was again noted in the order of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Army. In the battles for Kolobrzeg, the regiment suffered heavy losses. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Taldikin and Korunji Alexander Brok died a brave death. Taldikin's death was the greatest loss for the regiment. People whom he commanded, whom he led so many times into battle, to whom he passed all his combat experience, the art of pilot and fighter, lost with his death not only his favourite commander, but also the closest and dearest person. After fierce battles for Kolobrzeg, Polish units moved westward. Together with the Soviet troops, they liberated the Baltic coast up to Szczecin, and pilots of the 1st Regiment received a new assignment to conduct a thorough reconnaissance of the island of Gristov and to photograph it. It was a rather mysterious task. It was not clear what significance this small island could have for the further offensive. It did not look like a submarine base at all, had no airfield, port, and in general seemed quite harmless. And yet, 3 times a day, 2 fighter planes took to the air, and, breaking through the dense barrage of anti-aircraft artillery from a height of 1,500 metres, made photographs. Gradually, a detailed map of the island was born. On it, we could already notice some vague outlines of buildings, shelters, something like concrete pads and access roads. Everything was carefully camouflaged. And one day the command cancelled flights over Gristov. The task was completed. The matter was completed by attack aircraft. The factory and the launching pads of the Fo-2 rockets were destroyed. In April, during the battles on the Oder and for Berlin, our fighters had to endure the most difficult test. The pilots of the regiment, and in particular the squadron and wing commanders, had gained quite a lot of experience by that time. The regiment was relocated to the airfield in Barnoko, near Kostrazin, and although the tasks assigned to the fighters were the same, reconnaissance, covering attack aircraft, patrol flights over the location of their troops, the nature of the air battles changed fundamentally. Previously, enemy pilots in every possible way avoided entering into battle and over the battlefield and in the depths of their defences and break through the front line in the rear of our troops. They almost never succeeded. Now, against the Soviet troops storming the enemy defences on the Oder, Hitler's command threw a lot of aircraft, of which most of the fighters, controlled by experienced aces, pilots of the Berlin air defence. Therefore, almost no combat sortie was not without air duels. The Nazis, using their numerical superiority in the air, were now trying to attack, and yet, despite this, most of the air battles ended with the victory of our pilots. In these days, the regiment lost only 1 airplane. Pilot Lieutenant Stackhouse, after a battle with 3 fighters, was forced to land the plane on the field, crashing the machine in the process. All wounded, he returned to his airfield the next day. According to confirmed data, Polish pilots shot down 9 enemy planes in air battles. In addition, according to unconfirmed reports, 6 more planes were shot down. The first success in the battle fell to the share of Lieutenant Kalinowiecki and Lieutenant Kromer. Both pilots flew on reconnaissance. Crossing the front line, they received an order by radio to attack the enemy planes that were bombing the positions of our infantry. Having turned around, the fighters laid down on a combat course and soon met 3-6 Focke-Wulfs. The Nazis did not have time to drop their deadly cargo. Despite the disparity in strength, Kalinowski began the attack. German planes hurriedly left behind the front line, dropping bombs on the positions of their own troops. But not all of them left. One of the Focke-Wulfs, shot down by Kalinowski's aptly timed shot, crashed down, leaving behind a long tail of black smoke. On the same day, Captain Bave, performing a mission to cover the attack aircraft of the 3rd Regiment, processing German positions on the west bank of the Alte Oder River, shot down the 2nd Focke-Wulf. The 3rd Nazi plane was shot down by Lieutenant Kozak during a reconnaissance flight, and then almost every day brought new successes. Over the airfield in Eberswald, Lieutenant Bobrovsky and Chorunji Lazar attacked 12 Focke-Wulfs. Bobrovsky shot down an airplane with a long burst. After that, both our fighters, skillful manoeuvring away from unequal combat, continued reconnaissance flight. Once Kalinowski and Kromer, who flew out for reconnaissance, suddenly attacked by 12 Messerschmitts. This time the enemy planes had not only numerical superiority, they flew higher than our fighters. But the friendly pair was not confused and soon moved from defence to attack. Having shot down one of Hitlerites, Kalinowski soared up and disappeared in the clouds. The sub-lieutenant Kromer also managed to get out of the battle. Once, performing another task to cover the Ilov of the 3rd Assault Regiment, Lieutenant Verbitsky had to get involved in a protracted battle with Messerschmitts. Hitlerites tried with all their might to thwart the attack of our attackers, but every time our fighters drove them away. Eiley had to reach the target unharmed. It was a matter of honour for all pilots, and the planes reached. One Messerschmitt became the prey of Lieutenant Verbitsky. Returning from reconnaissance over Neuruppin, Lieutenant Haustovich and Chorunji Schwarz unexpectedly met with 2 Focke-Wulfs and shot them down. From the airfield in Barnoko, the regiment made 318 combat sorties. On April 25th, the regiment moved to the airfield in Leuenberg, on April 30th in Vehlefanz, and on May 2nd in Mötlov. In total, during these days, the regiment made 245 combat sorties. Such hard work of pilots was possible only due to the exceptional dedication of the technical staff. The enemy was rapidly retreating, and there was no time to exchange and repair aircraft at the factories that were thousands of kilometres away from the front. The engines had to work much more hours, guns and machine guns to produce much more shells, and all equipment to withstand a longer service life than it was provided for in the instructions. And if it were not for the dedication and enthusiasm of aviation engineers, technicians, mechanics, and other specialists, the regiment would have ceased to be combat capable. Mechanics of the 1st Fighter Regiment never once failed the pilots during this last offensive. Not a single sortie was cancelled due to malfunction of the material part. By order of the commander of the First Army, the regiment conducted reconnaissance in 3 areas, using the same method as during the battles for Warsaw. Each pilot conducted reconnaissance of a specific area. Reconnaissance flights were repeated every 2 hours. This order allowed the command to receive timely data on changes in the situation. The 1st Southern Area first covered Neulewin, Bad Freienwalde, Biesenthal, Bernau, Hackenberg and Vritzen. Then, as the advancing troops advanced, Oranienburg, Vehlefatz, Felten, Verbellin, Kremen and Nauen, and at the end of the offensive, the Havel River from Brandenburg and Plaue through Pritzerbe to Rathenow. The 2nd area was at first limited to the towns of Angermünde, Joachimsthal, Eberswalde, Oderberg and Lunow. Towards the end, it expanded as far as the Havel and Elbe rivers, between Havelberg, Schönhausen and Rathenau. In the north, the 3rd area started from Seydin, Angermünde, Griffino, Harz and Schwedt and reached the Elbe, north of the mouth of the Havel. the pilots reported their observations to the command by radio, which greatly accelerated the actions of the attack aircraft of the 3rd Regiment. It often happened that a reconnaissance plane, which had transmitted information about the withdrawal to the rear of a column of enemy tanks, had not yet had time to land, and the attack aircraft were already in the air, in a hurry to destroy this column. It also happened that a pair of yaks, returning from reconnaissance already in the air, met a formidable formation of ill, covered from above by their comrades in arms. In these days, as before, the Ilyas of the 3rd Regiment operated from the same airfield as the fighters that covered them in the air. The attack aircrafts were continuously working on Hitlerite positions in the area of the river Alte Oder and the settlements, Sedinia, Stara Rudnica, Altritz, Fritzen, Bad Frenwalde, Eberswalde, Felefans, Neuruppin, Fehrbellin, Dechtow and Rathenau. Thanks to the yaks covering the attack aircraft, the 3rd Regiment did not lose a single airplane. The Fetas patrolled over the fighting orders of the units of the 5th Polish Army in the area of Felefans, Oranienburg, Kremen, Nauen, Friesack, as well as over the Alte Oder and Havel crossings. During these flights, air battles were often fought. In the battles on the Oder and in the battle for Berlin, the regiment lost 2 pilots, Lieutenant Shirokun and Korunjego Veshknitsky. They died before the victory only a few days. For participation in the battles on the Oder and for Berlin, the regiment was again marked in the Order of the Supreme Command of the Soviet Army. Another 20 combat sorties from Mötlov Airfield and the end of the war and for the regiment, the end of 9 months of fighting. On its combat route from Warsaw to Berlin, from Vistula to Elbe, the regiment made 1401 combat sorties for 1393 flying hours. Among them, 610 sorties to cover the combat operations of the 3rd Assault Regiment, 571 reconnaissance sorties, 202 patrol sorties, and 18 sorties on other missions. The pilots of the regiment conducted 56 air battles, shooting down 9 Nazi airplanes. In addition, presumably, 6 more airplanes were shot down. Lieutenant Kalinowski shot down 2 Focke-Wulfs, Captain Baev, Lieutenants Haustovich, Schwartz, Lieutenants Kozak and Bobrovsky, 1 Focke-Wulf each, Lieutenant Verbitsky, 1 Messerschmitt. In 396 attacks on ground targets, the pilots of the regiment destroyed and damaged 40 automobiles, 11 steam locomotives, a warehouse of military materials, as well as railroad cars, river and sea vessels and other objects. In the battles, the regiment lost 6 pilots and 12 airplanes. This closes the combat page of the glorious history of the 1st Polish Fighter Aviation Regiment, Warsaw. Polish pilots, together with Soviet soldiers with weapons in their hands, entered Poland by the shortest road to fight for its liberation and independence in their homeland. On May 9, 1945, the regiment flew to Bydgoszcz. Here the regiment was reorganized and its material part was renewed. After the reorganization, it was permanently based at the airfield in Modlin. For a whole week, Hitlerites methodically shelled our airfields in Harwolin and Zheleshov, and the railroad between the towns of Minsk Mazowiecki and Damblin from a long-range gun, carefully camouflaged and hidden somewhere in the woods on the left bank of the Vistula, most likely in the vicinity of Warka. The shells were falling more and more accurately every day, and there were more and more casualties, especially in the area of Minsk. The shelling hampered the work of both airfields. It had to be stopped. On September 1, 1944, at 14 Orsous, a formation of attack aircraft, accompanied by 4 fighters, took off from the airfield in Zadybastar. It was necessary to find and destroy this gun, which was believed to be mounted on a railway platform, and manoeuvred along the road running parallel to the Vistula. Sitting in the cockpit of his yak, Korunji Chovnitsky from time to time looked at the ground, on which 4 outstretched shadows of Ilos of the 3rd Assault Regiment were rapidly gliding. Leading the link, hero of the Soviet Union Lieutenant Kitaev. An experienced pilot, always neglecting danger, he seemed to be sure that he would come out of any trouble unharmed. Not without reason, they said about him that a bullet does not take him. Humpbacked Ely, nicknamed by the Germans Black Death, go close formation and glisten in the sun with the convex windows of their cabins. Above them, the plane of Lieutenant Colonel Taldikin, who flies in a pair with Korunji Gabis, and even higher, about 200 metres to the right. Korunji Chovnitsky paired with Lieutenant Baev. Chovnitsky should cover Baev in case of a surprise attack. It's easy to say cover Baev. After all, Baev, an experienced air ace, although he is 26 years old, and he is older than Chovnitsky only 5 years. He has already made a lot of combat sorties, and the young pilot flies with him in a pair for the first in his life combat mission. Chovnitsky stares into the sky. A thin layer of clouds with frequent blue gaps stretches at an altitude of 2,500 metres. The sun's rays, as if through a lace curtain, penetrate through the clouds and dissipate in a slightly transparent, almost opalescent misty distance. The sun is not shining at all, but in its rays the distance is shrinking and the contours of objects are blurred in a murky haze. In this diffused light grey silhouettes of enemy fighters can easily escape the attention of the pilot. But Nazi planes now rarely appear in the air, so the meeting with them is unlikely to take place. But their air defence still operates quite clearly. Below, on the land ploughed by bombs and shells, stretches the line of the railroad. You can see the half-burnt ruins of the station Laskajev. And ahead, all in the glare of the sun, sparkles Vistula. Stormtroopers make a smooth turn, a slight change of course to the right. Following him, and obediently turns a pair of Lieutenant Colonel Taldikin, then Baev. Suddenly, from behind the buildings, from the trenches on the left bank, and from the edge of the woods, after the planes flew pink and greenish beads, lines of fire. The young pilot's consciousness only now comes to his senses, the fire of anti-aircraft batteries. Chovnitsky suddenly realizes that these are shells, that even one of them is enough to stop the engine, ignite the tanks, kill. "Attention, Chovnitsky," it is Baev warns him on the radio. The leading man's car, slightly tilted, slides downward and then sharply soars upward. In the place where Baev's plane was a second ago, clouds of ruptures blossom. From the ground again bursts fire swarm and rushes upward. Chovnitsky immediately throws the plane on the wing. Down, up. Instinct acts faster than reason. The shells whiz past. "Well done." Baev's calm voice is heard in the headphones. "Do you understand now?" "Well, it's not so terrible," says Chovnitsky. He says what he really thinks now, and mentally adds, "First of all, prudence." They fly over the Vistula, descend with a slight deviation to the south, and the first pair of fighters separates from the group even more to the left. The search begins. They fly between Magnusow and Grabau, then further east, as far as the banks of the Pilika River, and again south and north, going even beyond Waka. Here and there you can see numerous railroad lines and dead ends running off on both sides of the main railway line. They dive into the forest and disappear there, and it is impossible to see what is done there under the spreading crowns of old trees. The planes once again turn south from Hinuv and Dravaliev and descend to a height of 400 metres. The pilots stare intently into the green carpet of the forest, stretching on both sides of the railroad all the way to Radom, into the barely visible threads of forest roads and clearings. Their gaze seems to filter through the frequent fine stitching of railroad ties and lingers on every suspicious object. They search. But even from this dangerously low height, it is impossible to see all that the forest conceals. And suddenly, from somewhere in the dense spruce forest, or perhaps from the edge of the pine forest, where, it seemed, nothing suspicious could be, large-caliber machine guns began to speak, anti-aircraft guns struck. The fear ceased as suddenly as it had begun. And everything is calm again. On the highway leading to Kozanis, lazily blowing dust, brown mist rises above the trees, drifts between them, and abruptly stops just after the bridge over Radomka. Further, the highway turns to the left and climbs a small hill, and the railroad deviates to the right and goes away from the highway. And just at the moment when the first pair of fighters fly over the river, from the ground open a barrage of anti-aircraft fire. This is no longer indiscriminate, but a dense barrage of many batteries, subordinate, apparently, one experienced commander. Chovnitsky's keen eye quickly finds on the ground the reason for such a fierce fire. On both banks of Radomka, to the left and right of the highway, a large concentration of tanks. That is why the Hitlerites were so stubbornly unwilling to let our airplanes pass. At the same minute, the voices of Baev and Taldikin are heard in the earphones. Attention! Tanks! Tanks in the woods by the river. The cannons of one of the Elos had already started to talk and hit the tanks, but at that time the officer in charge, Kitaev, having given full throttle, began to leave quickly to the south. After Mim, obeying the command, one after another followed the other three ill. Behind the stormtroopers, as on an invisible tugboat, Yak. Machines stretch out in a long chain, something like a huge fairy tale dragon dismembered into pieces. Kitaev again makes a U-turn, flies over the highway, and approaches the river, where the enemy tanks are lurking. 7 parts of the dismembered dragon follow him at regular intervals. Suddenly Kitaev's sludge rushed to the ground. Here we go. Black death rushes straight at the mouths of the cannons aimed at it, and now rockets slid from under the wings. The cannons of the attack aircraft began to talk, and the machine guns began to drown. At the same moment, anti-aircraft guns rumbled frantically from the ground. In a continuous cloud of explosions, attack aircraft, like a huge shell, with a growing roar, rushed toward the fire flow. It seemed that he was about to break through the thick crowns of trees and crash into the ground. But no, here, almost touching the tops of trees, the machine soared upward. Behind the first, outlining the target, fiercely rushes down the second stormtrooper. And again, in the last fraction of a second, literally 10 meters above the trees, the next attack aircraft, releasing rockets, goes away. The same repeats the fourth. The barrage of fire from the ground is weakening by the minute. Here are already visible only individual flashes. Here already, through the dense crowns of trees, breaks through the scarlet-red flame. Now rushes to the ground Yak, Lieutenant Colonel Taldikin. From the hurried shot of his cannon, the tops of pine trees trembled, the ground is already smoking, and the flames of new fires are bursting out, with a long line of Kurunzi Gabis ahead of the surviving tanks that tried to open fire on the plains. Kurunzi Chovnitsky is keeping an eye on whether fascist planes will appear. But in the air, no foreign machine. The commander of the Elov quickly shortens the interval between the planes, and Baev is already diving on his Yak, pressing the throttle. Above the forest, higher and higher, rises a black column of smoke. It will be easier to aim, thinks Chovnitsky, looking at the column of smoke, but here is his turn, down. The machine obediently lowers its nose and picks up speed with a whoosh. The antenna buzzes, the hull vibrates. For a split second, Chovnitsky sees Baev's plane gaining altitude and immediately presses both throttles. From the shots, Yak all shakes. In the rumble of bursts, you can distinguish the hurried bass of a cannon and the ringing trill of a machine gun. Through the crowns of trees already visible, grey hulls of tanks. On them, thinks Chovnitsky. On them! And at the same minute he notices that the ground is quite close. Cut reddish trunks of pines, green branches. Even the brown cones are quickly growing in his eyes, rushing straight into the frame of the sight and about to flatten in it at the collision. Bring the handle to bear. The Koranji instinctively pulls the handle, ahead of the thought of manoeuvring. Yak, obedient and nimble, it, like a storm, sweeps over the very tops of the trees and soars upward. Chovnitsky, with a sigh of relief, passed. At this time, ill again attack, releasing the last jet shells. They are followed by fighters. Now Chovnitsky shoots more sparingly. It is necessary to leave some reserve just in case, and on the way back, attack aircraft should not be left without cover. The return home goes quietly, except for the shelling over the German positions in the area of Sveja. The fire opened by the Hitlerites is quite weak, not worth attention at all. Armoured Eilers do not even change course. Fighters flying on the sides and above them, having manoeuvred, easily leave the zone of fire. Here is already Gellerhof. From afar you can see the blue-green field of the airfield in Zadibastar. Coming in against the wind, the planes, one by one, go to land. The task is accomplished. On September 24, 1944, at 12 and from the airfield in Zadibastar, a fighter wing under the command of Major Vikerkovich took off. They flew in pairs, Major Vikerkovich with Lieutenant Podgorski and Lieutenant Poruchnichak with Lieutenant Lubetsky. The pilots had to patrol over Warsaw and fight against enemy planes shelling and bombing insurgent positions. It was my 6th combat sortie, Vikerkovich tells me. Only the 6th because in September 39th, as you know, there was nothing to fly. Yes, I know about it. The handful of Polish pilots who had the opportunity to fly in the first days of the war, to fight the enemy, everyone considered lucky. Vikerkovich, then still a lieutenant, was not one of these chosen ones. I met him during our retreat from Demblin, I think near Kotsk, or maybe near Vlodava or Krasnystav, when there was no doubt that we were defeated. He was carrying out some evacuation task and tried to fulfill it as best and conscientiously as possible. Today, thinking back, we both see how unnecessary and ridiculous this assignment was, but at the time it seemed important and responsible to us. It was the sense of responsibility that made Lieutenant Vikerkovich stay in the rear. He felt that he had to fulfill the order at all costs. The year 1939 separated us from Vikerkovich, and only now, in Modlin, I finally met him again, already as commander of the Warsaw Regiment. We recalled our long-ago fleeting meeting in the days of the September catastrophe. He told me about his fate in a few words, succinctly and without unnecessary lyrical digressions. When I asked him about the patrol flight over the blazing Warsaw, Vikerkovich looked at me with a smile. "Will you write about it?" I nodded affirmatively. I will not be able to tell about it, as I would like to. You think out for yourself what you should and what you should not describe, and throw away everything unnecessary, everything that smells like phraseology and false pathetics about unbreakable courage. I can't stand that nonsense. He stopped talking and looked at me intently. I hastened to reassure him. I'll try not to overdo it, and the colonel began to tell. It began not quite usual. In the airplane he was put in the mechanics, because he himself could not climb into the cockpit without help. On the last day before his flight to the front, he sprained a ligament in his knee at Gostomel airfield near Kiev. Of course, he didn't tell the doctor about it. The devil knows what he could think of. He might send me to the sanitary unit or even to the hospital. At a time like this, you understand? It was ridiculous to give up flying for such a trifle. When walking, of course, his knee hurt, but in the airplane he could easily use the control pedals. It was more difficult to get in and out of the cockpit, but he trusted the mechanics, and they did not give him away. The formation, turning to the leeward edge of the airfield, prepared for takeoff, full throttle. The plane roared over the ground and disappeared in the distance. 2 pairs of yaks, turning over Yarchev, made a circle over the airfield and, quickly gaining altitude, lay down on the course. A strong wind was blowing from the starboard side. "This east wind and ruined me," said the colonel. "If it had not been for him—" But about that later. We passed the airfield of our night bombers in Garvalin, left Otvotsk on the left, and came to Milosna. From a height of 1,500 metres, Warsaw was visible as on the palm of our hands. It was on fire. The wind was blowing smoke from the direction of Prague. A huge cloud of smoke was rising upwards. German artillery was firing from the suburbs of Warsaw, Pruskov, Racine and Bilan. From the centre of the city, probably from Sasky Park, mortars were pounding, and from the ruined old town, tanks often fired. At that time, the rebel positions were already only separate, isolated from each other, fiercely defending pockets of resistance. Every day they became fewer and fewer. Vikerkevich extinguished the cigarette butt and fell silent, watching a thin stream of smoke, which disappeared after a minute. "You can't forget this," he said. Silence reigned again. He did not tell me what was going on in his soul when, flying ahead of his link, he saw Warsaw again, after 5 years of wandering. No, its ruins. Warsaw dying in an unequal battle. I guessed it from his tightly compressed lips and his hard gaze, staring off into the distance, over the surrounding objects. And, believe me, Vikerkevich added suddenly, as if finishing what he had not said, believe me that each of us, or rather each of them, he corrected himself, each of our pilots remembered it, remembered over the Oder and over Kolobrzeg, and especially there, over Berlin. I wasn't in the regiment then. It was the damned wind. I still can't forget it. When the formation was already near the Vistula, the Warsaw shore met the fighters with the fire of anti-aircraft batteries. One of the shells exploded right under the engine of Vikerkevich's car, and only he had time to command, "Turn left," as he immediately noticed the flames at the bottom of the cabin. In the face struck suffocating smoke, smelled like a furnace. The heat blinded. Yet he continued to slide onto the wing. "Maybe we can knock down the flames." But the fire had spread to the fuselage and was getting closer to the tail of the airplane. Clouds of black smoke and dark red flames of burning gasoline and oil with every moment more and more filled the cabin. It was impossible to pull further. The overalls from below were already smouldering and smoking. His eyebrows and eyelashes burned. The tear-stained eyes stung unbearably. "Jump," he thought, but he still hesitated. The shore of Prague was so near, he wanted to reach his own. He opened the cabin and tucked his legs under him. The oncoming stream, making it difficult to breathe, whipped at his face and pressed him against the back of the seat. Carefully, so as not to lose his balance, Vikerkevich fumbled with his foot for the control knob and levelled the car. Every second threatened to explode the tanks and at the same time brought him closer to Prague. He looked back at his formation. 3 yaks were following him. His wingman, Lieutenant Podgorski, covered him, continuing to keep slightly to the left and above. "That's what calmed me down," said Vikerkevich, accompanying each word with a light slap of the palm of his hand on the table. "Exactly that. They were following me, they saw me, and they couldn't help but see what was about to happen. Of course, I thought about the fact," he continued, "that they would cover me if the Nazis began to shoot me while I was dangling from the parachute. But I didn't have time to think about it. And in general, everything that I am now telling about in such detail and slowly happened lightning fast. Everything took barely 10 seconds, maybe even less. I could no longer withstand the flames that were roasting me alive and, gasping for breath from the smoke, pulled away from the airplane. And it was at that moment that I remembered a terrible incident that had happened in Demblin. Do you remember Lieutenant Grzybowski? He looked at me questioningly. Of course I remember, I said. He was my pupil in Bydgoszcz in the 25th year. Yes, that's him. And you probably know how he died, don't you? I knew that too. Lieutenant Grzybowski was an excellent fighter pilot and never lost his head in flight. But one day he lost it. Literally lost it. Grzybowski jumped with a parachute out of the airplane, which entered a hopeless corkscrew, and immediately pulled the parachute ring. This was his undoing. The silk dome that opened too soon slowed down his flight, and the plane was still very close. The sharp rib of the wing slashed Grzybowski's neck, and that's what I remembered in that brief moment, the colonel continued. If only not before the time. I wish what happened to poor Grzyb had not happened to me. The whole picture of that horrible story, from beginning to end, flashed through my mind lightning fast and amazingly distinct. in a moment when I broke away from the cabin and struck the antenna mast. From that impact I spun around in a whirlwind. I realized later what it was all about. Just in case, I curled up in a ball like a hedgehog and somersaulted downwards. I knew that at the moment of the jump I was about 1,500 meters high, and now I could not orient myself how much I had flown. The sky and the earth seemed to me like a frantic merry-go-round. I did not understand where I was being carried, whether to the clouds or to the ground, which appeared to be above and below my feet. I came to my senses a little when I noticed that my airplane was nowhere to be seen in the vicinity. The danger of colliding with the wreckage of my car had passed. Don't forget that all this lasted only a few seconds. All thoughts were passing through my head like in a kaleidoscope. Hitting the antenna mast, I completely lost the sense of time. So I decided to open the parachute. I knew that if I did it now, the slings would wrap around my tumbling body like thread around a bobbin, and the dome might not open. So I spread my arms and legs and tried to straighten my body. It's not easy to do that when you're rocketing downward. By some miracle, I got my body into the right position and immediately stopped tumbling, although the horizon was still dancing in front of my eyes. I fumbled for the extraction ring and yanked it as hard as I could. The extraction parachute opened and dragged behind it a white, wavy bud of a silk dome flower that had not yet blossomed. From it there were evenly unfurling slings. I noticed all this at the moment when I was flying with my back to the ground. The parachute had opened. I was carried over the Vistula to the shore. At first I couldn't understand whether it was Warsaw or Prague. Yes, I forgot about the wind. Vikerkiewicz shook his head and ran his palm across his forehead, as if driving away some intrusive thought that seemed to be interfering with his story. You see, there were fires in Prague too. Not as many as in Warsaw, but there were, he said quickly and seemingly without any connection with the proceeding. He seemed to be justifying himself to me. I see, I answered sympathetically. It was easy to make a mistake. Yes, but the wind. I should have remembered the wind in time. But not then, of course. Earlier. It was only now that I realized what he meant. The wind, the east wind, he had forgotten all about it when his plane caught fire, was taking him to Warsaw. Was he still reproaching himself for having jumped out too soon? If he had tried to endure another 10 seconds of that scorcher in the burning car, driving it further east, he would have been able to land on the right bank of the Vistula. But could he have held out? And would the tanks, which were about to explode, hold up? I voiced my opinion aloud. But the colonel waved his hand. Well, that's the way it happened. It's too late to talk about it now. He went on with his story. He, no doubt, was heading for Warsaw, and the formation was circling above him, ready at any moment to suppress with the fire of their guns and machine guns the slightest attempt of the Germans to shoot the defenceless pilot. But the Germans did not shoot. They saw that the pilot would fall into their hands anyway. He was still hoping to go down with the rebels. The wind carried him over the river, then over houses, ruins, over some gardens, squares. He saw men in German uniforms running towards him through these ruins from all sides. Who were these men, Germans or Poles? He knew that some of the rebels were dressed in trophy uniforms and differed from the Germans only by white and red armbands on the left sleeve. Vikerkiewicz looked at them from above, but naturally he could not see whether they had armbands or not. Several times he even shouted, "Poles!" But the answer was drowned in the noise of voices coming from the nearer ground. Vikerkiewicz landed near a high wooden fence, entangled with barbed wire from above. The fading parachute dragged him along the ground. He tried to stand up, but was prevented by a sharp pain in his knee. He did pull himself up, resting both hands on the ground. At the same moment, several men picked him up and clasped his hands behind his back. He felt someone pull a pistol from his back pocket and an ID card from his side pocket. Hearing German speech and shouts he didn't understand, he realized there was no hope of rescue. There were enemies all around. Vikerkiewicz asked loudly, "Do any of you speak Polish?" Holding his ID card in his hand, a young SS officer approached him. "You are a prisoner of war, Mr. Major," he said in Polish, and saluted. This phrase, uttered with a sense of obvious superiority and triumph, as if a shoe hit Vyakivich on the head, although he already understood where he had gone. "I was literally killed," said the colonel, and it seemed to me that it still hurts him to remember it. "Understand me, just started fighting the enemy, and such an end." But then I heard the roar of engines overhead. Above me, above the crowd of armed enemies, my unit was flying. It was carrying out a combat mission, a half-hour patrol over Warsaw. I saw it again when I was being driven under guard in an automobile through the ruins, saw and heard the batteries pounding on the airplanes in impotent fury. I watched to see if any Nazi planes would appear in the air, but there were only 3 of our Yaks in the sky above the blazing Warsaw. I was carried in an open automobile. Next to me, comfortably reclined, sat an SS man. When we turned into a narrow passage between the ruins of houses, he gestured theatrically at the ruins and, shaking his head, said with feigned sympathy, "There is no more Warsaw, but it's a pity." This fake pity or senseless reproach to who knows whose address struck a nerve with me. Who does this idiot hold responsible for the terrible destruction of the city? Us, or the rebels? Or maybe all those who didn't want to become slaves of the superior Aryan race? I looked him in the eyes and immediately shifted my gaze to the sky, where my wing was victoriously circling. "There is no longer your Luftwaffe," I said proudly. "No more your airplanes over our Warsaw. And soon, you will see, there will be no more of them over Berlin. Soon, soon enough, the reckoning will come." My words affected him like a cold shower. His smugness was gone. It was as if he choked and silently stared at me with bloodshot eyes. I thought he was going to lunge at me or shoot me in the car, but he held back. "You seem to be forgetting yourself, Mr. Major," he said through gritted teeth. "I am not your prisoner. You are my prisoner. You are a German prisoner." I answered him that, on the contrary, I remembered it very well, but that it would not last very long. And indeed, Major Wyszkiewicz did not stay in captivity for long. He was taken from Warsaw to Skierniewice, then to Lodz, from where he escaped and took refuge with relatives near Plonsk. 4 weeks after his escape, the area where he found refuge was liberated from the Nazis. If by the appearance of a person could be judged about his profession, I would never have thought that Captain Cromie, a pilot. Yes, appearances are often deceptive. Captain Cromie is a puny, slow-talking man with a pale, oblong face, on which the eyes clearly stand out. He had some remarkable eyes of a greenish colour. They stared coldly from under light-coloured eyebrows, between which, on the smooth forehead, sometimes lay a sharp wrinkle. These eyes, sullen and obstinate, seemed to conceal in their clear depths some thoughts that I did not understand. They were the eyes of a strict judge, under whose scrutinizing gaze one could not hide the truth or evade a direct and unambiguous answer to an equally direct and unambiguous question. The captain's gaze seemed to pierce through that this officer, still so young, knew much more about his interlocutor than he knew about him. He seemed to know the innermost thoughts and desires of every man he encountered, while keeping his serious and pale face, the face of a mysterious sphinx, completely unperturbed. Of course, everything I write about Captain Cromer and the other pilots of the Warsaw Regiment is based on my personal impressions. It is quite likely that someone else would have noticed completely different traits in these men, would have seen them completely different from what I saw them as. It cost me a great deal of labour to reproduce, on the basis of their meagre accounts, a few pages of the regiment's combat history. Captain Cromie proved to be a particularly difficult man for me. I tried to extract from him something more than a meagre recital of facts. I don't know whether he had any personal accounts with the Nazis, but from his dry answers I was able to conclude that he had a fierce hatred for them. I had the impression that several years of waiting for an active struggle with the enemy had been for him a continuous streak of suffering, that he had deeply experienced the years of occupation of Poland, the years of despair. One day, looking intently into my eyes, he said, "This war was too short for me. I had no time for anything. Such a statement seemed to me almost blasphemous. The war was too short for him. I immediately doubted the maturity, the depth of his experience, the clarity and seriousness of his judgment. So, under the guise of nobility in him hides the soul of a professional soldier for whom the war is first of all feats, personal glory and the horrors of war and human suffering, a matter of secondary, indifferent. It turns out that I was very wrong, overestimating the merits of this strange man. I looked into his green eyes, which suddenly seemed to me cruel and faded, just like a madman or a criminal, and suddenly I saw a sneer in them. It confused me completely. How could it be? I began uncertainly. Do you think— But he interrupted me before I could finish. No, you misunderstand me, and you resent me in vain. I rejoiced in the day of our victory like everyone else. I never thought the war would drag on. It's just that we entered it too late, only in the fall of the 44th year. That's why it was too short for me. But, well, there's no help for it now, he added, and was silent. Well, and you? I asked, taking advantage of the pause. What about me? He answered. I was then still a green youth, and Matveev was accustoming me to real shelling. You'll need it, brother, he used to say to me after such a bath. It's only training, and when you get into real trouble, then you won't be afraid of the devil himself, and you'll learn to shoot for real. When he, without a moment's hesitation, threw himself into the thick of it, I was shivering and the sky seemed as big as a sheep. He died. Well, if you fight like that, it's not hard to die. But it seems to me that anyone else in his place would not have done half of what he did. Matveev was lucky as hell. I don't remember him ever coming back from a mission with a seriously damaged vehicle. Everyone expected it to happen someday. But none of us thought his death would be so ordinary. I didn't understand what the captain meant by ordinary death, and not wanting to interrupt him, I waited for him to explain it to me. He frowned his eyebrows and thought for a moment, searching, as it seemed to me, for the right words to express his thought more clearly. But I was mistaken. He spoke of something else entirely. You know, I loved him very much. And then he stopped talking. That succinct phrase had a special effect on me. Perhaps it was because it was spoken in the same dry and businesslike tone he used to talk about everything that concerned him. He was much more willing to talk about others. Some of us have long foreseen the imminent death of Captain Matveev, Cromy began one day. Whoever had ever flown with him on a mission expected this misfortune any minute now. The thing is that Oleg Matveev became simply furious as soon as he had the opportunity to attack an echelon, a column of vehicles, tanks, or fire on enemy positions, and if such an opportunity did not present itself, he looked for it until he found it, and when he found it, he mercilessly poured lead rain on the enemy from cannons and machine guns from extremely close range. I witnessed his ninefold attack on several steam locomotives standing on the spare tracks at Radom Station. All anti-aircraft guns that were in the vicinity of the station for 15 minutes hit our planes, but Matveev did not notice it until he riddled the steam locomotives. From the pierced boilers, white sultans burst out jets of hot steam, and Matveev once again hawked from above on the station building. Lightning swept over it, firing the last shells into the windows of the station packed with Hitlerites. Do you think there was a single scratch on his car? Not one. Suddenly, Cromy looked at me so closely as if trying to figure out whether he could trust me. I don't know if he made conclusions in my favour, but at that moment I felt like a smuggling passenger who had been brought to the customs office and x-rayed, and the expression in the captain's green eyes remained as indifferent and gloomy. After a minute, he talked about something else, taking his penetrating gaze away from me. In September 1944, the unit was tasked to photograph enemy fortifications behind the Vistula. In this unusually risky venture, the Nazis organized a very strong air defense here, Except for Kromer and Matveev participated Lieutenant Kalinovsky and Kozak. The success of the prepared offensive could depend on the results of the task. That is why it was assigned to Captain Matveev's unit. 2 pairs flew out on the mission. The commander of the Even with Captain Koromy and Lieutenant Kalinovsky with Korunj Kozak. Matveev and Kalinovsky took photographs. Koromy and Kozak covered them. Each such sortie lasted about an hour and a half, which was the limit of human endurance in the hellish fire from the ground. Sometimes it seemed to me that we would never be able to photograph some areas, Koromy continued to tell me, glancing at me from time to time. Matveev flew in a straight line, which he had marked out for himself using several landmarks on the ground. I, following him a little higher up, was looking out where the anti-aircraft guns were coming from. Usually, they were coming from everywhere. I could not distract him, but, clenching my teeth, I still almost every minute I threw him. Forward. Straight. Although I was always manoeuvring, dodging the fire. Of course, I remarked, you were a wingman and could not fly by a string. You didn't need to put yourself in that kind of danger. He stared at me, trying to understand my thoughts, and for a minute he weighed his answer. Certainly, he said at last. But, you see, it's not exactly pleasant. What? I questioned. Manoeuvring your plane like that, while your comrade is forced to fly without the slightest deviation from the course. And only when the danger of being shot down became threatening for Matveev, I shouted to him over the radio, "Move to the right." He would immediately turn around and evade the fire, losing or gaining altitude. After turning around, he would return to the same place and continue taking pictures. And again the German anti-aircraft guns opened furious fire on him, and again I had to warn him. And again he would go off to the side and come back again to photograph, risking his life, another 200 or 300 meters of carefully covered terrain. We met particularly dense barrage fire near Piaseczno, Warsaw and Modlin. In the Bialyansky forest, the Nazis had ammunition depots, and in Modlin, an airfield, which had a strong air defence. There stood tanks, which also fired on the airplanes. 3 walls of barrier fire on the outskirts of Warsaw was like an iron fence 2 kilometers high. It was absolutely impossible to get through it. Shells were exploding everywhere. It seemed that there was not 100 cubic meters of air above the ground, which every second would not be penetrated by machine gun bursts or bursting shells. And in response to this incessant fire, Matveev could only press the button of the aerial camera or maneuver when this scorcher became unbearable. But neither of these things gave even a minute's discharge, which is experienced in similar conditions when dropping bombs, firing rockets, or pressing the throttle. Then a duel begins between a pilot and enemy anti-aircraft gunners, in which the chances of both sides are equalized. You may be shot down, but you also sow death among the enemy. And when you take pictures, you evade the fight, and even in such disadvantageous conditions. After all, every maneuver is a forced termination of the task, and the loss of time needed to return to the point from which the shooting should continue. The constant consciousness that you are a defenseless target, on which the enemy with impunity fires all his anti-aircraft fire, the consciousness that you cannot answer him, acts oppressively on the nerves of the pilot. It's risk without revenge. You're not an enemy, you're just a hunted animal. And the mission turns from a fight into a game with 2 unequal chances. A game, Kromer said slowly, staring at me with a fixed gaze. Yes, it is a game, and what tricks it does not require. I nodded, and the captain went on with his story. They had to photograph some parts of the terrain several times. The pilots used the clouds to suddenly appear from behind them over the most inaccessible object for a few seconds to make a photograph, and then go back into the clouds. They came from the west, from where the Nazis did not expect them, and, pursued by hurried volleys, extracted a few more meters or even tens of centimeters of precious film. Thus, a map of enemy fortifications on the Vistula was gradually born. The weather was not always favourable to the pilots, and the pictures were often not clear enough. Therefore, from time to time, we had to make sorties for visual observation over Warsaw, Grodzisk, and Soshachev. We were flying shaving and passing low over the ground more than once took the opportunity to deal with the batteries, especially annoyed the pilots in the previous sorties, when they felt defenceless and, like hares, had to loop and twist, escaping from mortal danger. Finally, this difficult task was left behind. In January 1945, everyone witnessed the lightning strike of the Soviet troops and units of the 1st Polish Army on the enemy fortifications on the left bank of the Vistula River. Under the onslaught of the advancing troops, the Hitlerites' defence cracked and collapsed. Probably the map, for the sake of which Matveev and his comrades risked their lives, helped them out more than once. Now they could finally get even with the enemy anti-aircraft guns. The pilots knew from memory where the firing positions of anti-aircraft batteries were. They knew where to approach from and how to dodge the shells of these damned batteries. Now the planes attacked columns of tanks and infantry, and on railway echelons and on crossings, and even on automobiles, meeting almost no resistance of fascist fighters in the air. Later, the regiment was given a new task and relocated to the liberated airfield in Bydgoszcz. From here it conducted reconnaissance over Debrecno, Wierzchow, Zloczenek, Chaplink and Pila. There, near Pila, Matveev was killed. Captain Cromie said the last words in his usual dry tone, as if reluctantly squeezing them out of him. He stopped talking and, meeting my gaze, looked at me point blank. I endured the pause and the stare, trying in vain to guess what he thought of me. "Who would have thought that he would die so usually?" said the captain bitterly. "Such an outstanding ace. But the mission was the most ordinary, so Matveev's death struck us all as a ridiculous accident. Such a death could, meet any pilot." He was silent again, and I was silent too. In my heart I could not agree with the captain that outstanding pilots should die an unusual death. I thought only that the Cromie capital really loved his commander very much, if he thought that his death should be heroic. After a minute the captain spoke again, and never once looked at me again. He seemed to have come to the conclusion that nothing much would happen if I learned in more detail about some of the circumstances of Matveev's death. Captain Matveev took off from the airfield at Bydgoszcz. It was a cold, cloudy, windy day. There were clouds stretching from the west, and under their low gadfly a pair of yaks was flying for reconnaissance in the area of Debrecno. They flew over a dense network of roads, over lakes connected by rivulets and canals, disappearing into a large forest area that stretched far to the south, all the way to the Warta. To the north and east the forest, cut by roads and railroads, skirted Chojnice and connected with Tucholskaya Puszcza. Here enemy troops were concentrated, hastily pulled up from the depths of Germany and even from the Western Front. This was evidenced by the movement of convoys and the accumulation of echelons at railroad stations. For Matveev, these signs were quite enough to orient himself in the situation. He turned north, toward Jastrowie, then turned around, circled over Walch station, and went back to the southeast, directly to Pila. On the way, he glanced at the map from time to time, obviously, as always, mentally preparing for a concise and accurate report on the results of his reconnaissance. He had an excellent memory and important experience for a scout in picking out from the terrain all details of military importance. He could easily connect them logically and note in them the very essence, often imperceptible to a less experienced pilot. And as always, having analysed his observations, he stopped thinking about them. He was now interested only in the fierce fighting that had broken out at dawn in the woods near Pila. There were fiercely defending selected Hitler's units, surrounded by Soviet troops. Matveev passed the railroad going towards Szczecinok and switched to a soaring flight. His wingman remained far behind and flew much higher. Therefore he could see well how his commander descended almost to the very roofs of houses to fire on the positions of enemy batteries on the outskirts of the city. The pilot, of course, dived behind Matveyev and also fired, but when the Nazis suddenly directed their fire directly at them, he could not stand it and soared upwards to get out of the fire. Matveyev, on the contrary, continued to attack with even greater fury, as if believing that not a single bullet would hit him. So they turned around several times, attacking the anti-aircraft guns on the outskirts of the city and the airfield, which still had a few planes. Suddenly, during one of the approaches, an anti-aircraft shell penetrated the left wing of Matveyev's plane. The shell exploded near the cockpit, and the machine turned over on its back. It was noticeable that the pilot was trying to straighten the machine, but he was apparently badly wounded himself. The airplane ceased to obey the rudder, went into a corkscrew, and fell between buildings. "Almost at the same minute our units moved to the last attack on Pyla," said Captain Cromie's smooth, impassive voice. "In half an hour the town was taken. Matveyev was found where he fell, shot down by anti-aircraft guns. Yes," Cromie added in the same tone, "yes, I loved him very much.